The wail of a siren in the distance was nothing compared to the sound of boots on the threshold. A pair of gloved hands shoved a cardboard box across the floor, and the scrape of it on the old planks felt like a verdict. Andrés stood by the doorway, watching. The kitchen light pooled at his feet. On the wall behind him, the pencil marks that measured Lucia's growth faded beside Elena's handwriting. Lucia, May 2011, inked in a slant that now looked like a letter from the past. Lucia held a photograph with the same stubbornness children have for small things that matter more than all the rest. It was curled at the edges, damp with the sweat of a morning they had not chosen. The picture showed a family at the river. Elena leaning into Andrés, her laugh captured as if time itself had decided to keep that second on film. Mateo, who could still fit inside one of his father's arms, rocked the picture like a charm, thumb worrying the image of Elena's face until it blurred. Vargas stood outside on the porch, a cardboard legal pad folded under his arm, a thin smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him were two more men in yellow vests and a uniformed messenger from the town hall who glanced at his clipboard as if to say this was simply paperwork. One of the men pushed a stack of legal-looking papers into Andrés's hands. The ink was official enough for someone to look at it and back away, and yet Andrés could see the worn edges where the signature had been coaxed into being by false promises. "We have 24 hours, Vargas said. His voice slid across the threshold like oil, slick and designed to keep things moving. "There's no use clinging to the past. We'll give you help with transport. We'll be humane." The word humane hung in the doorway and tasted like dust. Andrés wanted to punch the word into the floor. He wanted to hold them all and make them see that this house, this land, was more than a map reference. It had a grave in the yard where he had buried Elena 3 winters ago, a row of beans Elena had planted that sprang every spring whether he tended them or not. It held the sound of his children's first footsteps, the hollows of their laughter, the way the light broke through the kitchen window at noon. It held the smell of Elena's shawl tucked in the closet, naphthalene and lavender, and the promise he had made to her on that last night in the hospital that he would keep them safe. Vargas lifted his chin, and the men behind him shuffled for boxes as though they had rehearsed the choreography. 2 workmen carried an ancient rocking chair out into the light and stood it on the porch like a misplaced monument. A neighbor from next door watched from behind his curtains, eyes the size of coins. Someone muttered that Andrés should be grateful they weren't harsher. "I'll not leave you," Andrés told the house, though he knew the house could not answer. He bent over Lucia and kissed the crown of her head. "We'll go where we must. We'll come back." Ooh. Lucia's small face twisted. "Why would they take us?" she asked, as if there was a rule book she had missed. "It's not about why," Andrés said softly. "It's about what we do next." They packed with the methodical desperation of the dispossessed. A tin of spices, Elena's shawl folded into a plastic bag, the picture from the river wrapped in tissue paper, Mateo's wooden horse, splintered at the leg but still wagging its painted tail, a tin lunch pail with their names on it from school. Andrés ran his fingers over the old scars of the house. A hole in the plaster where a nail had once held a calendar, a burn mark on the workbench from a summer he had tried to fix the stove. He took Maddie's height marks off the bedroom door and traced the lines with a fingertip as if he could seal the years into the grain. At noon, when the movers had cleared the last of the boxes and the men from the town left with their forms, there was nothing left but the air itself, and Andrés turned the key in the lock for the final time. The house closed on a silence that felt like swallowing. They left on the second bus out of town, the one with seats stained by other people's hurry. The boys from Vargas' crew laughed in the back, voices thick with the kind of money that smells like diesel and new paint. A woman sat across from Andrés and Lucia, smelling faintly of oranges. She offered a sandwich and a look of pity that was almost worse than indifference. Mateo slept against his father's arm, breathing small and steady, while Lucia watched the fields pass. Rows of eucalyptus, fences, the occasional dog that looked up and kept on running. At the edge of town, the houses gave way to a wildness that looked like an idea of freedom. Andrés had always known the mountain, its bones, its slopes, the way the forest held winter and let go in spring. The memory that had lodged in his chest, the one Elena used to tell him, about an old hunter who had kept to the mountain paths and vanished like a shadow, rose in his mind with the stubborn logic of people with nowhere to go. Don Augusto had been a name woven into the village's past, whispered at markets and told to children as someone who had loved the forest too much to live within fences. They set out on foot where the road became a strip of mud and the bus could not follow. Lucia walked ahead with the solemnity of someone who had learned to shoulder responsibility quickly. Mateo ran in small circles, inventing enemies on the path, sticks to be conquered, puddles to be splashed through. The sky hung heavy, a sheet stretched so taut you could almost hear it beside you. The first fat drops of rain began to fall like hesitant advice. By the time the trees closed above them, the wind had grown hands. Rain came in sheets, turning the path into a slick ribbon of black. The children's boots sank into the mud, and Andrés felt it in his joints, a reply his body gave to the cold. He had forgotten how sound could disappear under a storm, how the world could press itself into a single task of survival. He pulled his jacket tighter, the way a man ties a knot on a rope when there is nothing else to do. Night came as if summoned, a sudden wrap of darkness and deeper rain. They lost the path twice. Once Andrés had to simply stand and listen, letting the sound of the forest teach him where the slope was and where the hollow would take them if they missed a step. He cupped his hands around Mateo's shoulders and whispered stories his mother had once told him to keep the child's mind from thinking of hunger and loss. Lucia sang under her breath, a small tune she had learned in school, words bent and soft in the wet. They stumbled into the silhouette of a cabin as the storm threw down its last handfuls of rain. For a moment, the world narrowed to a rectangle of light through glass, and the smell of smoke that suggested a hearth that had been warm not long ago. The cabin sat like a secret, half swallowed by vines and a carpet of moss. The door was jammed with rot, but the hinges gave with a sound like a sigh, and the three of them tumbled into a room that smelled of old wood, mothballs, and the faint, honest smoke of long-dead fires. Inside was a world of suspended things, a table layered in dust, a stack of tins, a rifle mounted on the wall with faded initials on the butt, a heavy trunk bolted to the floor. The air inside the cabin was warmer than outside, and when Mateo laughed, whole and unabashed, it sounded like a small magic. Lucia ran her finger along the mantel, leaving a streak in the dust like a signature. Andrés closed the door and put his back against it, as if the wood could push him forward into something better. He cursed softly, and then laughed with a sound that was half relief and half disbelief. "Well," he said, aloud to the room, to the ghost whose name might be attached to this place, "we found a house that doesn't currently belong to Vargas." The children set about claiming corners. Mateo found a tin soldier beneath a bed. Lucia discovered a faded scarf tied on a nail that might once have been a curtain. Andrés knelt near the trunk. It was a baúl, sturdy, iron-rimmed, its leather cracked with age. He ran a thumb along the latch, feeling the grit of salt and time. Something about the trunk felt like the hinge on which their fate might turn. When he opened it, the chest sighed and released a smell like a memory, naphthalene and old paper, and the particular ache of an attic in which someone had once kept their life in a bundle. Inside were small, deliberate things. A rifle socked in cloth, its metal dulled to a soft gray. A stack of photographs wrapped in a ribbon gone brittle with time. A ledger tied with twine. A leather-bound diary with a name pressed into the cover.
Augusto. He did not know why his hands shook. The rifle had initials on its wood, A.M., carved with a care that suggested pride rather than theft.
The photograph on top showed a younger man with a face like a map of hills and laughter. Beside him, a woman who held a child in her lap and looked out of the frame as if she had seen something no one else had. The child in the picture, small and serious, had eyes like Mateo and a jawline Andrés felt in his own palm, familiar as an old tool. Someone else had loved this place. Someone else had tied their life to this land with knots tighter than signature and paper. Andrés turned a page in the diary, and the handwriting flowed like a small river, steady strokes and moments of tremor. The first entry was dated decades ago and spoke in a man's plain voice about the mountain and the animals and a wife named Rosa. A later line said, simply, "They took him." The next entry had a name, Tomás. Andrés read the words aloud without meaning to. They took him. They took my boy to the town and said I had no right to keep him. I did what I thought best. If anyone ever reads this, know that I kept what I could for him, the land, the rifle, the map to the spring. If Tomás ever returns, may he find his markers. The pages were smudged in places where tears or rain had met ink. The diary folded into a story that smelled of grief and stubborn loyalty. Letters to Rosa, notes about seeds, mentions of a document kept hidden in the baúl, a title to a 50-hectare parcel. The words felt like levers. They shifted something in Andrés. He had been evicted from land he had called home for years, but here, in a trunk that smelled of dust and lavender and old cloth, was a paper that could mean that the land belonged to someone, and perhaps that someone could be found. Lucia peered over his shoulder and read the name in a whisper, Tomás Augusto Mendoza, and then said it again like a charm. She looked at Andrés with a fierce, almost grown-up gleam. "Do you think this means it's ours?" Andrés swallowed. He did not want to promise. He folded the page back and pressed the diary to his chest as if he could hold the past like a shield. His mind skittered through possibilities. A legal title, a deed, an old man's claim that might be worthless in the face of Vargas-forged papers. He knew enough to know the elemental truth. Paper declaring ownership meant something only if it could be proven, if a person with claim could be found. He also knew enough to know that the town loved the smell of new construction and the song of money more than the shushed voice of old deeds. Outside, the wind had not quieted. The trees scratched their complaints against the roof, and somewhere beyond the cabin, the sound of distant engines rolled like a warning. They ate a tin of beans warmed over the coals, and the sound of chewing felt like a ceremony. Mateo tucked the wooden horse under his arm and slept on an armchair that still sagged from years of use, his small chest rising and falling. Lucia curled under the faded scarf and read the edge of a photograph until the image blurred into a map of what had been and could be again. Andrés sat by the hearth with the diary open on his knee and a sheet from the baúl unfolded across the table. It was a document thicker than the rest, a deed with watermarks and hand-stamped creases, the ink faded but the words still legible. A 50-hectare parcel, a notation about boundaries traced with a steady hand, a seal pressed into the corner. The heading carried a name, Tomás Augusto Mendoza, and a date. The paper smelled like oak and the slow rot of time. Whoever had protected this item had done so with intention. For a long moment, Andrés just looked at it. His life had been a series of small, honest acts. The beans tended, the repairs made, the little hands taught to tie laces. He thought of Elena's hands, the way she'd wrapped bread in a towel and tucked notes into his jacket for him to find later. He thought of the height marks on the bedroom door and the promise he had made. If this paper could be the string that pulled them back from the edge, then he would spend every breath proving it until the law listened. He did not know the law. He knew the smell of engines and the weight of money, and how men like Vargas used ink to make something real that was not. He knew, too, that a document in a trunk could be called a forgery. He knew that this town's memory of its own past was short and could be erased by nails and concrete. And yet, as the rain thinned and the children slept, the diary and deed in front of him were as real as his fingers. A wind knocked a curtain at the cabin's single window, and the rifle above the mantel glinted. Andrés rose and, for the first time in weeks, felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long while, the small, sharp green of hope. It was not triumphant. It felt like a seed under wet earth, patient and waiting, but it was enough to make his chest loosen a little. He sat back down and began to read the diary properly, aloud yet quietly, so the words could seed themselves in the room. Pages described a man's love for the forest, the ways he trapped the streams into pools where the trout would gather, the way he planted trees in straight lines for someone who might one day sit in their shade. There were names, Rosa, Augusto, and a thin thread of accusation, the sort of line you find at the bottom of a newspaper cutting. Somebody paid somebody else to take what was not theirs. There was a diagram in the back, sketches of a boundary marker, an old oak with a notch on its southern side. "Save this," one note demanded. "If we are separated, this will show you." He traced the diagram with his finger, until his fingertip found the tiny notch marked in ink. The notch, the deed, the name, Tomás, sat together like the points of a compass. Somewhere up in the mountain air, the world seemed to hold its breath. Lucia, half awake, tugged at the sleeve of his coat. "Do we keep it here?" she asked, voice small as a coin. "For now," Andrés said. "For now, we keep it safe. We rest. We think." He could already see the edges of the decision forming. Find Tomás, prove the deed, get a lawyer, show the forged papers that Vargas had forced upon them. But those were things of towns and people far away from the damp wood in which they huddled. For the moment, all that mattered was the small light of the lamp, and the rhythm of Mateo's sleep, and the knowledge that in the trunk, among mothballs and old maps, lay an anchor. They slept in the cabin with the door tightly shut, and the diary between them like a small, shy lighthouse. Andrés dreamed of a woman with Rosa's hands tying a red ribbon around a child's hair. He woke to the soft sound of rain gone to drizzle, and the smell of someone who had been long gone, making room for new breath. When he got up, light slanted through the window, and the forest outside had a new green, the way a bruise looks lighter the day after it forms. He drank water from a canteen, listening for the far-off pulse of a road. He ran his thumb along the edge of the deed again, feeling the raised watermark beneath his skin, as if its own texture could confirm its truth. There was a small folded envelope at the bottom of the baul he had not opened the night before. Inside was a note, clipped in a hurried, almost frantic hand. A directive? "If you find this, tell Tomás where the spring is. He knows the map. He will know what to do." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the diary. Andrés folded the envelope back into his pocket without reading more. The map in the diary's back pocket showed a winding creek, the snap of a small bridge, and the way the oak trees sat like a sentinel on the southern border, precise enough that a man who had walked those trees would know it without needing GPS. He had not yet decided to whom the deed truly belonged. He did not know if Tomás lived under a different name in a city 3 valleys away, or if he had been buried long ago, and the papers would simply be a memory. He did not know how a judge in a courtroom would look at a photograph and a diary and say, "Yes, your claim is valid." He only knew that he had something he had not had before: direction. He stepped outside to stretch his legs, and the world smelled of wet bark and the sharp, clean scent after rain. Birds, newly emboldened, argued with each other across the clearing. The children were awake, but quieter now, as if the presence of the trunk had settled them. At the edge of the trees, where the slope dipped, Andrés noticed fresh tire tracks. They were not old, the mud had not yet congealed around the tread. His stomach tightened. Footprints, boots with a distinct zigzag tread, led towards the path they had come in on, and then vanished into the damp underbrush. He tracked them with his eyes, the way a man might scan grain before it's sown. Someone had been near the cabin within hours. They had not been there yesterday. He moved back to the door and listened. The world seemed deceptively still. For a moment, he allowed himself another small thought. Maybe Vargas was simply a man who had made bad choices, slick talk and thinner conscience, the sort of man who would bribe, file, and force a family out. Then the image of the engine noise he had heard when they left town, the laughter of the men behind Vargas, established itself, and he could not shake it. Lucia came to him, eyes worried. "Do you think Vargas knows where we are?" "I don't know," Andrés said, honest. He wanted to be braver than he felt, but we must act like he might. They took the rifle off the wall, its metal cold and somehow dignified, and Andrés held it like an understanding of the place. There was a name carved into the butt that matched the diary, Augusto Mendoza. And for a second the world snapped into an old story that reached far before any of them had been born. A man who loved a place so much he left clues in trunks and on trees for a son he might never see again. The rifle, the deed, the ridgeline, they were part of each other now. A set of keys with an uncertain lock. He had a plan, small and stuttering. They would stay put long enough to see if the tracks led to the cabin. If not, they would try to make for the town in the morning, find the registrar's office, show the deed to someone who could read its stamps, and tell them what a man had once sworn on paper. If Vargas had forged anything, someone had to look at these papers carefully, compare dates, check signatures, bring out the kind of official eyes that could see fraud. He thought of Lick Mendez, an old man in the town who sometimes had an ear for the wrongs of the land. But that was a name for the future, a tool yet to be contacted. For now, they strengthened the door with a fallen beam and piled heavy stones into a window well. They moved quietly, the way people do when they want to make their presence less like an invitation and more like a claim. As dusk leaned on the trees again, Andrés sat with the diary open on his knees, reading aloud passages that described the river and the notch and a small boy's face. He read of Rose's laughter, of the day someone came and offered a bag of coins, of the decision that left a man alone with a rifle and a name carved into wood. When he said the name, Tomás, aloud, it felt like a bell in the cabin. Mateo looked up, eyes still heavy. Lucia touched the page with reverence. Outside, the forest breathed. A rustle in the undergrowth made Andrés still as a stone. He put his finger to his lips and whispered, "Shh." The sound of someone moving under the trees was faint. A person being careful, or someone who meant to be careful so they wouldn't be seen. Andrés could not tell. He rose and moved to the window, peered through a slit in the vines. The light was low, but he could see a shape. A truck parked half-hidden behind a copse of pines, its engine off, but the smell of oil in the air. A flicker, someone's hand, crossed the roadway. He could make out the outline of a man with a heavy coat, a cap drawn low. The zigzag tread of the boots in the mud matched the tired boot prints he had seen. Whoever it was, they had followed his path. Adrenaline did the job that fear might have done in other stories. It sharpened his vision. He went to the rifle and cradled it as if it were an argument to be made. He thought in concrete bullets of the things he might show if the man came to the door. The deed in his hand, the diary on the table, the photograph of a child who might be someone's son. Proof, he told himself. Proof was language everyone used eventually, even men like Vargas. Footsteps approached, deliberate, not hurried. The figure did not call out. The man circled the cabin like a cat, careful, smelling for weakness. Andrés felt small and enormous at once. Small because he had nothing to return with but paper and history. Enormous because he had 2 children and a mountain behind them. A voice broke into the night, gruff, male, the kind of voice that expects an answer. "Anybody in there?" Andrés' mouth was dry. He stepped to the door and, for the first time, met a face that belonged to one of Vargas's crew. The man's jacket had paint on it, a smudge that said he'd been working where land met machine. He raised a flashlight, and its beam slid into the cabin, catching dust and faces. Vargas's man looked from Andrés to the children and back again. "You folks lost?" the man asked, with the honeyed cruelty of a man who knew he could choose to look away. Andrés did not lie. "We're passing through," he said. "We'll be gone soon." The man's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer and then another, measuring the beam of his light on Andrés' hands, on the diary laying open like a private altar. "Vargas man wanted this place cleared," the man said. "You got papers?" "Not yet," Andrés said truthfully, "but there are papers." He kept his voice even because he needed to keep both men in simple arithmetic. They had 3 in the cabin, Vargas had numbers, and men willing to use them for the smell of profit. The man was silent for a count that felt like an hour. He sniffed the air as if reading a promise, then turned and walked back toward the truck, boots sinking slightly, leaving a new line of prints in the mud. Andrés watched him go, the angle of his shoulders a message. He would report and then return with an instruction. Andrés closed the shutter with a hand that was steady because his hands had to be. He sealed the window and met his children's eyes. "We need to be quicker than we planned," he said. "We pack what matters. We move at first light if we must." Lucia's lower lip trembled, but she did not protest. Mateo scooted closer to his father and wrapped his small arms around the diary as if it were a sleeping animal that must not be disturbed. Andrés busied himself with practicalities. Wrap the deed in oilskin, bake a small loaf for the road, bury the rifle where it would be safe, and return for it when the light favored them. He wrote down the boundary marks from the sketch in the diary on a scrap of cardboard and folded it into his pocket. He took the photograph and clutched it so hard his knuckles whitened. Night settled like a blanket, and with it came the sense that the mountain listened. Andrés lay awake on a pallet and thought through the legal forms he did not understand. He thought of Lick Mendes's stooped back and the hush of a courtroom where men in robes read the law as if reciting scripture. He thought of fees and time, of the way formalities could make a wound heal slower or faster. He thought of Vargas walking the town like a man with a map of other people's lives in his pocket. A twig snapped outside and he grabbed the rifle. The weapon was heavier than he imagined and cold. For a man who had never shot at another, the rifle felt like the last of many defenses. He opened the diary and read a passage about warnings left for a son. "If anyone seeks to take what is ours, plant these markers and know where the spring feeds the land. Build a fence with rocks, not with nails that rot. Trust the judge with truth, not with bribes." The words were simple and full of the kind of logic that survives time. Andrés slid the diary under his shirt and let sleep come. Dawn came pale, and with it a silence that felt like the before of a storm. Andrés already had the list in his head. Get into the town, find Mendez, speak with the registrar, check the paper's date, find if the signature had any record. Every step had people attached to it, with their own interests. He stoked a small fire and cooked a thin soup. The children ate and then took turns sitting by the baul, fingers tracing maps as if they could imagine a future from paper. Lucia touched the ridgeline on the map and whispered, "This is where our house is," naming the very hill that had been home to their deaths and their joys. At the last moment before they set out, Andrés paused at the rifle and, half out of defiance, half out of respect,
carved a small notch into the stalk next to the initials. It was a simple mark, a line like the slash of a tally. He thought of Don Augusto marking trees and tracing borders in ink. This notch would forever belong to them now. It would be a story the children could tell. The day we found the trunk and the notch we made. They left the cabin with the map hidden in Andrés' shirt and the diary wrapped in his coat. The world seemed mysteriously calmer with the papers secure. The path waited, and they followed it with the slow confidence of those who must move carefully. 2 hours into the descent, they heard the engine before they saw the truck.
It came in from the ridge, not toward them, but across the valley, and the sound carried with a certainty that made Andrés' stomach drop. The truck paused at the crest, and a man stepped out, stretching like someone who had been waiting. He raised binoculars and swept the slope. Andrés mouthed a prayer he had not spoken before in the open air. It was not a plea for a miraculous rescue. It was a petition for luck that had the shape of preparation. Let me be ready. He led the children into a copse and pressed them against a trunk as the truck's light swung across the clearing and missed them like fate looking the other way. The engine turned and the truck drove off, but they could see the tracks were fresh and the cab's silhouette carried the long, ugly shadow of possibility. Andrés felt the pulse of his heart against the diary stowed at his chest and thought of all the steps that had to be taken. He did not know whether the name Tomás would become a key to their salvation or merely another fact to be argued. He only knew that this place, this stubborn patch of mountain with its trunk and its rifle and its paper, had shifted something inside him. They continued, moving slow, the path between trees like the spine of the world. At a bend in the slope, Lucia stopped and pointed. In the mud, unmistakable as dread, were the prints of boots. 2, then a gap, then more. They filled the path as if someone had walked back and forth in search. Andrés felt the hairs on his arms rise. The prints were not far from the cabin. Whoever had been there had been close enough to see the light through the window. He crouched and pressed his hand against the mud, feeling the coolness. He straightened and looked at his children, feeling suddenly the smallness and the strength of their bodies against the world. "Stay close," he said. "Follow me." They moved quickly now, not running so much as stepping with purpose. The valley opened and the town came into view, roofs like bits of a scattered puzzle, the church tower a broken tooth against the sky. Andrés' plan sharpened into an urgency that had corners. Go to the registrar, find the deed's imprint, get Mendez to see it, keep Vargas from knowing the exact paper they had. He thought to himself that the law had the patience of a glacier, but could cut a valley if given time. He would be that patience. As they entered the town, someone in a cafe looked up and watched their faces. A dog barked. A child on a stoop shouted a name and then laughed at nothing. The town had a rhythm Andrés had known since childhood. He stepped into it as if walking into a room where people were already writing his story in the margins. He had the deed, he had the diary, he had a photograph of a child who might be the key. He had, too, the stubbornness of a man who would not let his children sleep on a road without fighting for the ground that had raised them. And somewhere, across the valley, men drove with trucks and intentions. He would find Leak Mendez. He would ask the questions that had no easy answers. He would open the baúl's chain of evidence and begin the labor of proof. For now, he carried his hope like a folded map, and as he walked the familiar streets with children by his side, he felt the weight of something that could tilt either way. Behind him, the mountain held its secrets. Ahead, the town hummed. Between them, a man named Vargas prepared a plan. Between him and the path toward justice lay papers, time, and the willingness of strangers to tell the truth in places where money had taught men to look the other way. Andrés tightened his grip on the diary and, with his children close, stepped toward the registry office that stood like a small fortress on the plaza. The clock in the tower clicked, and the day began to unfold the way it does in small towns, slow at first, then with the inevitability of events that must happen when certain papers are put into certain hands. He did not know then how long it would take for the world to bend toward what was right. He only knew that in a trunk in a little cabin on the mountain there were words that might tip the balance, and that if nothing else, they had somewhere to build again. Before the registry's door closed behind them, Andrés pressed his thumb into the folded map in his pocket and felt the paper's rough edge. He thought of the oak notch and the rifle and the photograph, a puzzle of signs that might lead to a name. He inhaled, tasting the coffee and dust of the town and the faint metallic note of fear, and then pushed the door open. If someone was following them, if Vargas's men had found tracks, and if the town's ears were not as deaf as he feared, then the next hours would show it. He stepped across the threshold and into the room where names were recorded, where ink could be the difference between exile and home. The registrar's office smelled of soap and paper and the faint, weary tang of people who had stood in line for answers. Andrés stood with the diary pressed to his side like an animal of memory, and the clerk behind the desk took the deed with a practiced hand that scanned for stamps and names as if they were small, secret languages. The room hummed with bureaucracy, an old fan turning, a woman reciting an address, the scratch of a pen. For a moment, Andrés felt like a trespasser, not in mountains, but in a system he had never learned to navigate. The clerk read the heading slowly, like a man used to translating old songs. Tomás Augusto Mendoza, he said, mouthing the name as if testing the syllables against his own tongue. The stamp on the paper had an official crease, and under the clerk's lamp the watermark caught the light like a ghost. He tapped the document with a worn finger and called someone over, a registrar with thin glasses and a patience that came from years of reconciling paper with people.
Mendez was waiting outside the courthouse by the time Andrés left the registry, as if he had been carved out of the building itself. He was older than Andrés expected, gray at the temples and careful with his hands, the kind of man whose suit was more habit than fashion. There was a look in his eyes like an old dog recognizing a familiar footstep, the steer of a man who had seen similar fights and survived them by leaning on law rather than luck. "You came to the right place," Mendez said without ceremony. He set the deed on his knee and read with the sort of attention that makes simple things hard to hide. "But not all deeds are what they seem. We will need to confirm its registration, check for endorsements, and, most important, prove that this paper's chain of custody is intact. For that, we'll need the parish records, the registrar's ledger, and an expert who can verify ink and seal." Andrés's throat tightened in a way he had practiced not to show the children. "How long?" Mendez did not lie. "It depends on who we need to speak to and how quickly we can compel them. If Vargas suspects we have the deed, he will move. We'll ask the judge for an injunction to stop any works while we sort this out. That will give us breathing room. But injunctions require evidence and a cogent affidavit." "And the diary?" Andrés asked. "The diary is circumstantial but powerful. Photographs, names, the rifle initials, these are threads. We'll stitch them together." Before they left the little plaza that held the registrar's office, Mendez paused and looked at Andrés as if weighing something that mattered more than law. "You did well finding this, but you must be cautious. Men with money know how to burn traces. If you're following Andrés's fight and want to see how it unfolds, please like and subscribe. This story needs witnesses." The message was meant for an audience beyond the four walls of the story, a small breath of a call that would appear on the screen. It was short, almost apologetic, and then it was gone. The work had to be done in person. Mendez took them to the parish, where ledgers lay in a glass case, and a woman in a black apron rang the page like a bell, calling up dates and names. The ledger showed a record for a child, Tomás, registered in the year the diary suggested, but the place of birth and the attendant's name were abbreviated. In a separate ledger at the town hall, there was a baptismal entry linked to a Rosa Fuentes. The chain was faint but present, not proof by itself, but a string that could be pulled. Meanwhile, Detective Silva began to move through the town with a quiet rhythm. He was not theatrical. His coat was plain, his shoes scuffed in places where honest work retired old shine. Mendez had known him by reputation, and the detective had the slow certainty of someone who liked facts arranged in lines. He interviewed the registrar, examined seals, took photographs of ink impressions, and sent samples to a document expert in the city.
He wrote notes in a small book with a careful hand that meant business. Back at the cabin, distance and time seemed to compress. Andrés had driven his children to the registry with the map hidden in his breast and the rifle notch a secret tally. He left the cabin in the hands of a man named Tomás, though Andrés did not yet know him by that name. The first contact came when a neighbor from the trail, a man who cared for the slopes and knew the old hunters' paths, mentioned a guardabosques who had been patrolling the area for months. "He's a good man," the neighbor had said, "quiet, keeps to his rounds, talks to the trees a bit." It was the sort of description that read like a map to those who knew how to follow it. Tomás's arrival at the cabin happened without fanfare. A truck, a pair of boots, a hat more suited to sun than to drama. He wore the uniform of a guardabosques, but his hands that had learned knots and tree grafts, bore a different sort of weather. When he stepped into the doorway, the light fell on a face that was steady and plain, not eager for recognition, but not closed to it either. His gaze wandered across the interior as if inventorying things that had been left like punctuation marks on a long sentence. "Someone's been here," he said simply. "New tracks, fresh." Andrés nearly answered with a defensive note, but Tomás's look was not meant to threaten. He crouched near the baul and touched the leather as if to check its age. His fingers brushed the rifle stock, and for a moment he did not speak. His face moved through something like memory and surprise. "It's mine," Tomás said, and the words arrived both like accusation and claim. "You," Andrés began. Tomás held up a hand. "My name, I'm Tomás Mendoza. My mother told me stories. She named me before she left." He paused, almost embarrassed at how small the admission felt in a place full of old things. "I didn't know this house had been his." The diary's pages had already been read by Andrés. Now Tomás read them himself with a kind of reverence, as if the handwriting unlocked an internal map. The entries mentioned a rosa often, and the photographs showed a woman with a particular set of lines carved around her mouth. Lines Tomás recognized because his mother had the same. A necklace in the photograph was a tiny charm in the shape of a bird. Tomás reached down and touched a similar dented metal under his shirt. He had carried it all his life without knowing where it came from. "Rosa Fuentes," he whispered, "my mother's name." They spoke for hours on that first day, not just of ownership, but of histories that had been separated by choices no single life could fully explain. Tomás explained he had been raised in a village 2 valleys over, fostered by a woman who was kind but who could never fill an absence. He had chosen the work of the forest because it made sense. The trees kept to themselves. They did not demand proof.
He told Andrés the names of springs he had made notes of, how the boundary oaks had been marked by a man who liked straight lines. He did not yet claim the title, at least not loudly. He wanted the truth more than the drama. The first clear piece of proof, aside from the diary, was the rifle. The initials on the butt matched the handwriting in the diary. The notation of an oak with a notch on the southern border matched a carved notch Tomás had recognized from his childhood hikes. The photograph of Rosa matched unmistakably a portrait that had hung in the small house where Tomás had grown up, an aunt's house where stories whispered about a man who had been gone a long time. These were not legal conclusions. They were the sort of human evidence that opens doors. Mendez filed a civil action, an ex parte motion for a temporary injunction to halt any development on the property while the court evaluated the ownership claims. He attached a sworn affidavit from Andrés describing the eviction and the diary's discovery, copies of the deed, and a request that the judge order a forensic examination of the eviction documents Vargas had presented. The judge assigned to the case, Ramirez, agreed to hear the petition that same afternoon. He was not a showy man, an even voice, a papered calm, yet he listened with a gravity that felt like honor. In the courtroom, the arguments unfolded in the quiet way of well-practiced things. Mendez presented the deed and the diary as a composite case. The deed bore a watermark and an ink impression that, according to an initial expert report, belonged to a municipal notary whose records did not list this particular transaction as completed. The eviction papers that Vargas had used were stamped with signatures that, when compared under magnification, showed irregularities, pressure points that suggested tracing, and, in one corner, an ink that did not match the date claimed. "Paper doesn't speak for itself," Judge Ramirez said, looking at the evidence spread like a map. "But it tells a story. The law must listen to the story and determine which parts are true." He issued a temporary injunction, ordering that all construction on the contested parcels cease immediately, and that no demolition or removal of artifacts from the land occur until the court could adjudicate the ownership. It was not a verdict, it was a pause, a legally enforced breath that kept men like Vargas from turning paper into dust. Vargas had anticipated prudence and patience. He was not a man to be stopped entirely by a judge's pen. When he learned of the injunction, he wore a mask of polite surprise. Privately, he tightened his grip on options. He was accustomed to making problems go away, or at least shrink until they were someone else's issue. For him, money was a solvent that dissolved more than concrete. It dissolved consequences. That evening, Andrés returned to the cabin with Tomás and the agreement of Mendez that the legal hold would buy them time.
For a few days, they could breathe and plan. The mountain seemed, for the first time since the evacuation, to lend them a hand. They put the diary in a box at the ranger's outpost for safekeeping. Tomás insisted the chest itself remain in the cabin, an anchor to the place it had defended. But Vargas was impatient in a way that was both crude and dangerous. He decided to erase traces. Late at night, with the smell of diesel and a sense of inevitability, he ordered a small team of workers and a private security man to burn the cabin and any papers that could be used against him. The plan was methodical. Bring gasoline, set a small controlled fire, claim it as an accident, and, with the cabin gone, argue that no evidence remained to support any claim. Andrés did not learn of the plan until someone told him, a worker on Vargas's payroll who could no longer endure the taste of his acts. The informer came in shivering with shame, giving the bare facts and a name, a time, the night after the injunction had been signed. Terror is sharp and clear. Andrés felt his chest tighten as if the air itself had been stolen. He and Tomás argued only briefly over the best defense. Tomás wanted to stand watch. Andrés wanted to call the police and the detective. They did both. By midnight, the night was a black page. The stars were pinholes of light, and the forest breathed slowly, its long lungs expelling nocturnal mist. Andrés and Tomás took up positions, quiet like shadows. Mendez had called Detective Silva and a police squad to be on alert. They could not guarantee they would arrive in time, but they could create a chain that would make burning the cabin an act with witnesses. The men Vargas sent crept into the clearing with the practiced silence of professionals who had been paid to ignore shame. One carried a canister with the raw smell of gasoline. Another carried torches. They moved like ants around a piece of sugar, certain, impatient. They were careful, too, not to make a sound that suggested they were taking orders from a man named Vargas who had the money to make things go away. The first flicker of flame was a splutter, and then a bad sound of dryness meeting heat. A curtain caught. The tinder of old curtains and dead leaves fed the sudden brightness. Tomás moved before Andrés could. He came out of shadow like a man who had been born to stop things from falling apart. He shouted then, less a battle cry than a command, and the men froze like rabbits. "Police!" came a voice across the clearing, and the night cracked with movement. Headlights, too bright, too sudden, sliced through the trees, and Detective Silva's truck scored a white line across the black. The would-be arsonists stumbled and turned in a panic.
One of them dropped the canister, the smell of gasoline blooming into the air. Vargas's men were not soldiers, they were hired hands. They were used to the protection of being on the payroll of the powerful.
Without that immediate possession, they splintered. One turned to run, another cursed, and the largest of them made for the truck. The driver's door slammed and dirt flew everywhere. A squad car rolled in, lights blue and red, and men in uniforms leapt out with the efficient motions of people who had practiced this choreography. Detective Silva did not make a scene. He moved with a calm that belied the surging adrenaline in his chest. He bound the canister as evidence, noted the time, took photographs, and interviewed the trembling men with a mix of stern and sympathetic tones. One confessed to a role, not to the names above him, but to the task at hand. Another muttered Vargas' name under his breath, like an invocation that made him braver and dangled him in police hands. They did not arrest Vargas that night. There were procedures, warrants to be obtained. But they did seize physical evidence: the canister, a rag with traces of accelerant, the torches, and a set of muddy footprints that matched those taken earlier near the cabin. Those footprints, once photographed and entered into the chain of custody, would tie men to actions. The law moves in lines and proofs, but when those lines are drawn with care, they become a road to accountability. Tomás was close to a breaking point. The idea that the place which had been his father's, and which now held the only document that might prove Andrés' claim, could be destroyed in a night made him bristle. He had never expected to be part of a legal contest, but he expected his hands to defend what his body remembered. He watched the men in custody led away and felt a strange compound emotion: anger at the attempt, relief at the prevention, and a quiet grief for what had almost been lost. In the days that followed, Detective Silva's investigation widened. He obtained a warrant to search Vargas's office. There, in a steel cabinet whose paint had the same sheen as a man's conscience, he found boxes with copies of documents, some official, some crudely altered. One folder bore forged seals that, under magnification, showed needle-like inconsistencies. Another contained receipts for services that had never been rendered. Among the papers was correspondence that hinted at a scheme: names of notaries, old signatures, and the odd, ugly taste of duplicity. Vargas, when confronted, took on the posture of someone who had been surprised to be caught. He smiled with a practiced softness and insisted, too loudly, that all his transactions had been above board. His voice was the kind money lends to men who fear nothing. At the arraignment, Mendez presented the forensic report. A handwriting expert had found 2 signatures on the eviction writs that were inconsistent with the notary's known hand. An ink analysis placed the writing on a different timeline. The judge, listening to the evidence, found probable cause to order Vargas arrested for fraud and for instigating an attempted arson. The arrest did not erase the damage of months of pressure and threats, but it made a clear public statement: actions have consequences. Court proceedings, however, were not neat and quick. They were sutures stitched slowly: witnesses, depositions, cross-examinations. Mendez used the diary as a narrative backbone in the hearings, a human document that gave context to the dry paper of title and ink. He called Tomás to the stand not as a hero, but as a fact: a man who could testify to family lore, to the rifle, to the photograph, to the records that linked Rosa Fuentes to the child named Tomás. Tomás spoke with the simple clarity of someone who had lived with the truth as a presence without knowing how to prove it. He told of his mother's name, of the pendant, of the song she had hummed. He described the oak's notch in a way that was specific enough to be checked on the land. Detective Silva produced the physical evidence seized from Vargas's office: the forged paperwork, markings, and a ledger that included payments to men who had worked to displace families. The judge listened and asked questions that cut through bluster. In a moment that felt like the pivot the story had needed for weeks, a municipal clerk testified that the supposed transfer of title in Vargas's favor had never passed through the required notarization, that the sequencing of stamps did not match the ledger, and that the signature dates were impossible.
Legally, the filings pointed toward relief for Andrés. The judge issued a provisional order recognizing the existence of serious questions about the legitimacy of Vargas's claims and expanding the injunction to include a forensic accounting of the transactions. There would be hearings, but the court's interim rulings prevented any further on-site work and ordered the preservation of artifacts, including the bowl and the diary, as potential evidence. There was also, in the hush of the courtroom, another quiet moment: a request by Tomás to be recognized as an interested party. Under the Civil Code, the legal title could belong to a living heir if the chain of descent and registration were proven. Tomás asked the court to allow him to assert his claim. He did not demand riches or authority. He asked to be acknowledged as the rightful heir to a legacy he had never been permitted to claim. Méndez filed the appropriate paperwork. In a matter of weeks, the town's archives produced a flimsy but critical file: a registry entry and correspondence that bore Rosa Fuentes' name and hinted that a child had been transferred under informal circumstances. The files were not a clean title deed, but when combined with the rifle, the diary, the photographs, and Tomás's testimony, plus the forensic report undermining the forged eviction, they formed a mosaic large enough for the law to interpret.
Tomás and Andrés stood together in the small office of Judge Ramirez when the provisional ruling arrived. The court acknowledged the existence of a plausible claim by Tomás and ordered a more thorough hearing to determine ownership. The hearing would take time. Legal steps require patience. But the ruling mattered. It opened the door for a real process. With the immediate threat receding, attention turned to something else: what to do with the land if ownership were finally recognized. Tomás, who had been blunt about his attachment to the forest, surprised Andrés. In private, he told the man who had sheltered him and his children that his father had written about stewardship and a wish that the land serve a future beyond one man's profit. "I don't want to fight for land to turn it into profit," Tomás said, picking at a frayed edge of the diary. "My father planted trees because he believed someone would sit in their shade. He wrote about a spring and about not cutting for the sake of selling. If this becomes mine, it won't be a pile of lots and houses." "Andrés," Méndez said carefully, hearing the consideration in both men's voices, "the law recognizes rights and obligations. If Tomás proves his claim, he can decide what to do with his property. He could sell it, or he could protect it. Your claim, the home on the 5 hectares, can be secured by a transfer if he chooses to grant it." The days leading to the final hearing were filled with the small labor of proof. An expert certified that the diary likely dated from the correct period. Witness statements tied the photograph to the family. Tomás produced an old locket that matched a portrait. Detective Silva compiled the ledger of Vargas' suspicious transactions. A community that had seen Vargas's men in yellow vests suddenly found a voice. Neighbors came forward to testify about intimidation, about offers of money, about a man who had promised modernization and left fear in his wake. It was not a chorus of saints, it was a slow, wrenching account of what greed had cost. The final hearing took place under a sky so blue it felt dangerous. In the courthouse courtyard, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors who wanted a result that would not simply hand their fields to someone else. People skeptical of developers, and faces that had been changed by months of worry. Vargas walked into the hearing with a grin he must have practiced in mirrors. His lawyers were polished, but the tide had shifted in ways he had not planned. Judge Ramirez read the submissions with an attention that made the room fall quiet like a church. He weighed the forged documents against the diary and the chain of evidence. He listened to the testimony of detectives and registrars, to Méndez's legal reasoning, and to the simple human truth of Tomás's claim. He did not promise restitution in the way that novels do. Instead, he issued a reasoned ruling.
The judge recognized the evidence of fraud in Vargas's filings and ordered that the title in question be voided pending a full investigation into Vargas's methods. More immediately, to resolve the human problem before him, Judge Ramirez ruled that the homestead, the 5 hectares that contained Andrés' house and garden, should be protected and awarded to Andrés pending the final adjudication of the entire parcel. The larger tract would remain in legal limbo, but the court also mandated the appointment of a conservator to oversee the land until all claims were settled. It was not a triumph in a single stroke, but it was enough to let Andrés breathe. The judge's order required Tomás to appear in civil registry documents to claim his rights in full, but it made room for acts of generosity and conservation as morally and legally meaningful. Tomás chose both. In a small ceremony in the month that followed, Tomás went to the notary with Méndez and signed a legal instrument granting the 5 hectares that held Andrés' home to him and his heirs. The grant was written with legal specificity, a deed transferring ownership of the homestead to Andrés Mendoza, conditioned on recognizing Don Augusto's legacy and preserving the surrounding habitat. Tomás then took the remaining 45 hectares and, with the help of local conservation groups and legal advice Méndez facilitated, established a protected reserve. The reserve had enforceable covenants limiting development, ensuring the forest would not be parceled out for profit. There was no fanfare worthy of a headline. Tomás did not seek one, but the act resonated. He wanted to honor his father's memory in a way that prevented others like Vargas from slicing the land. Establishing the reserve meant setting up a conservation board, a small endowment for maintenance, and a local committee that included Andrés and other villagers. It was imperfect, bureaucratic, but grounded in permanence. Vargas did not go quietly. He faced criminal charges for fraud and the attempted arson, and the public record of his arrest stained his plan to be seen as a legitimate developer. The trial that followed was procedural and dry at times, full of depositions and witnesses, but it ended with a conviction for falsifying documents and conspiracy to commit arson. He was sentenced to time and ordered to pay fines, though the community's true satisfaction came from the legal recognition of the wrong that had been done and the restitution that followed in land, not in cash. The cabin's restoration began first as a practical matter. Seals of preservation had to be applied, the baúl cataloged and moved to a secure location, and the structure stabilized. Tomás and Andrés, along with a few local volunteers, repaired the roof, replaced the broken window with glass salvaged from an old frame, and set the hearth to rights.
The artifacts were curated, not for profit, but for memory. The diary placed under glass, the photographs reproduced in a small album, the rifle cleaned and displayed with a respectful placard. They opened the little house as a small museum dedicated to Don Augusto and to the history of the land. It was modest, a single room with a plaque and a bench, a place where children could learn who had lived and loved the place before them. The plaque read, in words chosen for restraint, that the land had once been stewarded by a man named Augusto Mendoza, and that it now belonged to the community in spirit. The ceremony was small, families with bread, an old priest blessing the work in quiet Spanish, and a nod by Judge Ramirez, who attended without speech, his presence enough. For Andrés, the emotional restoration was as tangible as the boards nailed back into place. He walked through his property with a measure of gratitude that was quieter than triumph. He planted beans where Elena had planted beans and marked the doorframe again with his children's lines. Lucia, with a grown look in her face, marked a new line with a pencil and smiled like someone who had earned a small right to belong. Mateo made a new splintered toy and played under a tree that would shade him when he was older. There was a final legal step that hardened the resolution. Tomás completed the paperwork that formally acknowledged his parentage insofar as the law required for inheritance and title. A document in the ledger tied his name to Don Augusto's, and this, combined with judicial recognition and the material artifacts, closed the chain of proof in a way the courts could accept. The town's registry was updated, and the record placed the title in a way that made Vargas's prior claim impossible to resurrect.
The community's healing was not immediate. Grievances lingered in the mouths of some neighbors and in the hollow of efforts cut short. But the river of small reconciliations flowed. Neighbors who had watched silently began bringing bread. A local carpenter volunteered to help finish the cabin's bench, and a schoolteacher organized a small excursion so children could learn about stewardship and the value of land as more than commodity. Andrés and Tomás formed a new kind of kinship. They were not substitutes for what was gone. There was no illusion that a signed paper could resurrect the past, but they were the architecture of a future. Tomás told stories of his mother with a tenderness that had been tempered by distance. Andrés spoke of Elena not with blame, but with a kind of preserved worship. They visited Rosa Fuentes' grave together in a small plot under a crooked oak. The stone was modest, worn by weather, and the two men stood in a silence that had the weight of prayer. Tomás knelt and laid a small bouquet of wildflowers at the stone. "I never got to say thank you," he murmured.
Andrés put a hand on his shoulder and, for the first time since the eviction, felt the sense of having a father outside of the one in his blood, a man who would stand with him in the common work of repair. Seasons moved as they always do. The reserve took root, literally and legally. Saplings that Don Augusto had planted years ago grew into young trees that shaded new paths. The municipality recognized the protected area and granted funds for a simple interpretive center. Local students were invited to help with conservation monitoring. The cabin museum became a place for school trips, a tiny node where tales of stewardship could be taught alongside the mechanics of a river and the smell of pine resin. Time allowed small scenes of grace. Lucia teaching younger children to read beside the hearth. Mateo learning to tend a small plot of beans and beaming when the sprouts came up. Andrés, who had once been a man marked by loss and the fatigue of survival, found satisfaction in the slow, steady work of tending his land and repairing what had been broken. He taught the children how to tie knots for the garden, how to measure and trace the boundary lines with a careful hand. At the cabin's opening, a simple plaque was installed in honor of Don Augusto, in memory of one who loved these trees. People drank coffee and ate pan dulce. An old neighbor told stories he had once only whispered. The plaque was small, the words modest, but it was a public recognition of a private life. On the anniversary of the eviction, Andrés took his children to the little grave in the front yard where Elena slept. They cleaned the stone, laid fresh flowers, and Andrés whispered the small, steady words he had promised himself, that he had preserved her memory, that they had found a way back to a home, not in the sense of the same before, but in the sense of a place that could hold their names. Tomás stood a little apart that day, a man whose decision had turned a legacy into a protection that would outlive his own life. He had not chosen to be a savior. He had chosen to be faithful to what his father had written. In a moment of private quiet, he walked the ridgeline and found the oak with the notch. He ran a palm along its bark and listened to the sound of the forest, less of voice than a long, patient exhale. The months melted into years. The museum became a small, steady light in the community. Andrés's house was repaired and painted a soft cream. Lucia, older now, studied ecology in the regional university and returned on weekends to help with educational programs in the reserve. Mateo, taller and still mischievous, guided tourists on short walks and asked questions that made older men remember what wonder felt like. There was an annual ceremony to plant a tree on the reserve's birthday. People from the town, sometimes those who had not spoken during the hardest days, came. The judge, who had written the decisive injunction, planted a sapling and told a short story about law and the way it can be used to protect what is good if people insist. Mendez stood to one side with a cup of coffee, smiling in the way of men who had been useful to justice. On a cool evening years later, Andrés and Tomás sat by a small fire outside the cabin. The children were grown enough to walk the paths alone. The museum light cast a rectangle across the grass. Andrés looked at the man beside him and thought of how paths cross. They had been strangers who shared a past they had somehow pieced together.
Now they were co-stewards of a place that had nearly been lost. "You did right," Andrés said simply. Tomás shrugged, the muscles of a man who had carried wet wood and mended fences. "I did what my father would have wanted," he said, "and you kept your promise to Elena." Andrés swallowed and felt the hot, sweet ache of gratitude. He thought of his children and of the house where Elena's shawl still smelled of lavender. He thought of the notch in the rifle and the lines on the registry pages, and the way the world can, if pressed, listen. They rose together and walked the short path to the graveyard where Rosa's stone rested. A small light from the museum winked like a distant lighthouse. Andrés laid a hand on the stone. He spoke aloud, not a prayer, but an acknowledgement, of the way human lives braid into one another, promises made, promises kept, and the strange, enduring act of caring for what will outlast us. In the museum, a placard explained Don Augusto's belief that land is not merely a thing to be owned, but a responsibility to be tended. The children who came to learn would read the diary's restrained phrases and imagine a man who cared for trout pools and planted trees he would never sit under. That idea, small and stubborn, found a foothold. The last image is quiet, a family around a fire, hands toasting bread, a child's laugh that stitches the night together. Above them, the forest drew a dark outline against the sky, and on the ridge the oak stood with its notch, a small testament to continuity. A plaque on the cabin's door declared in a plain script that the house was a place of memory and a node of protection. Andrés looked at the flames and felt a kind of peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of a repaired possibility. He had been expelled with his children from a house that had been the center of his life. He had walked into a forest that held, in a trunk and a diary, the key to a different future. The law had been slow, but it had worked. People had been fallible, but they had been capable, too, of repair. Tomás had reclaimed a lineage not for the purpose of dominion, but for the purpose of stewardship. A developer had been forced to account for his crimes. A little museum preserved a life. A reserve protected a future.
On the quietest nights, when the children slept and the museum's light had gone out, Andrés would stand at the threshold of his home and think of Elena's hands. He would remember the promise he had made beside her bed and smile, small and private, at the fact that promises could be kept by many hands, not only by one. The forest, which had once been a refuge, had become a testament of the way truth can be excavated from old trunks, how papers and photographs can tip scales, and how names, once lost, can be restored to people who will guard them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about justice, land, and the quiet work of restoration. And if you want to be part of stories like Andrés, subscribe. There are many small reckonings that need witnesses.